Hey, I'm somewhere fairly awesome right now. Check this out. That is the church that sits on top of the Mount of the Beatitudes. That is the place where, according to church tradition, Jesus delivered the ultra-famous, ultra-important Sermon on the Mount.
The building and the grounds are a Roman Catholic church, and it's dedicated to the portion of the Sermon on the Mount called the Beatitudes. This is the opening foray that Jesus gives. It's a list of blessings that also double as a description of Jesus' values of his heavenly kingdom, which are the opposite of world values. The church grounds are a hot spot for religious pilgrims, but they still feel tranquil and, I don't know what the word is for garden-like. Gardenic? I'm making up words now. You know what I mean. But if you step outside the property, you get more of a sense of what it was like when Jesus actually gave the Sermon on the Mount. Quite a bit rougher, but the view is spectacular. You can see the whole Sea of Galilee spreading out below you, and you can almost see down to Capernaum, which is the town where Jesus was living and operating out of at this time. And there are plenty of spots that would work great as a natural amphitheater where sound would carry easily to cover a big group of people. Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapters 5 through 7. I think it's like the most important passage in the whole Bible. But did you know that there is a very similar sermon of Jesus recorded in Luke chapter 6 called the Sermon on the Plain? Well, people who think about the Bible for a long time have wondered if the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain are two slightly different recordings of the same sermon that Jesus gave on the same day, or if they might be describing two completely different events altogether. There are two really big challenges when you look closely at this. One, the sermons are way similar, but not identical. The verbiage is a little different between them. Matthew has some more stuff in it than Luke has in it, so what gives? The second challenge is that both sermons happen in a flow of a story, and the events leading up to each sermon and the events coming after each sermon look really similar, but the chronology is different. So there's some skin in this game here. Like, what gives? Is the Bible wrong? Is this screwed up? Was Matthew wrong? Was Luke wrong? Is the whole thing a giant fraud? Maybe. I mean, what we have here is a bona fide Bible crisis, which I think is a blast. So in this video, I just want to work through what the different options are for how to deal with this Sermon on the Mount, Sermon on the Plain thing. Explanation number one for the apparent friction between the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain accounts would be the Bible just got it wrong. I know that's really off-putting to people of faith, people like me, but if we're going to think about this thing honestly and we see a friction, we have to acknowledge that one possible answer to why that friction might be there would be because somebody just made a mistake. But a lot of things in life on their surface look like, that seems wrong. And as we look a little bit deeper, we see, okay, I see what's going on there. So before we throw out the baby and the bathwater and the tub, let's pump the brakes for a minute. I think I'm mixing metaphors right now, and consider a few more options for explaining this apparent friction between these two passages.
When I was doing my homework for this from a distance, I was really dismissive of the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain are the same thing, and people just describe the geography differently theory. That seemed dumb to me because mountains and plains are really obviously different. But now I'm standing up here near Chorazin above the traditional site of the Sermon on the Mount, and I'm kind of seeing what people are saying. That is the Mount of the Beatitudes right there. It drops off precipitously on the other side, but as you can see, this whole area is incredibly flat about halfway up this whole mountain complex. So, I don't know, maybe I can't be so dismissive of that idea. I felt all smug and good about myself, but maybe other people have points too.
A third possible explanation is that we're talking about two different sermons on two different days with two different sets of crowds. And in support of this idea is that everybody who wrote about Jesus tells us specifically that he traveled around to different villages and cities and communicated this message and did miraculous stuff. What doesn't hold up as well about this two different sermons, two different times, two different crowds theory is that the chronology of events leading up to and coming after both of those sermons they just don't work together super easily. Let me try to lay this out very quickly. When we get into the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus has already called some, but not all of his disciples. He then gives the Sermon on the Mount about 2 kilometers away from Capernaum, where he's living at the time. As he's coming down the hill, he runs into a guy with leprosy. A miracle happens there. The details are pretty specific. Then, Jesus runs into a Roman officer, a centurion. A miracle happens for somebody in that guy's household. Then, Jesus gets back to Capernaum, where he finds Peter's mother-in-law is sick. So, she gets healed. Then, there's a paralytic who some people bring in boldly to a place where Jesus is teaching, and that guy gets healed. Then, Matthew, the dude who wrote the book, has an encounter with Jesus, and he goes from being a con man and a scoundrel to following Jesus. It all adds up pretty neatly, and Matthew presents those things as being very chronological. He says things like, immediately after that, as he went away from there, as he walked to the next place. So Luke, on the other hand, has all of those same things, but everything happens before the Sermon on the Plain, except for the miracle with the centurion, the Roman officer. The weakness, then, of this 2 different sermons, 2 different days thing is that either somebody looks like they had their chronology off for whatever reason, or you'd have to believe that these very specific miracles with very specific details also all happened twice. And I think at that point, you're just getting into desperation mode. I don't think that explanation holds up very well. Maybe Luke got his timeline wrong on purpose. Now, that might sound crazy to you, but you watch movies all the time where things happen out of sequence. And there are 2 reasons you do that when you're writing a story or making a movie. And 1 is to develop tension, and 2 is to develop thematic material, to juxtapose things and put multiple topics in front of people and cause people to see themes and trends that are developing that might not be quite as noticeable if you did it chronologically. It looks to me like it's possible that the timeline in Luke is adjusted for just such a purpose. And further supporting that, Luke says stuff like, one day as he was teaching. Oh, while Jesus was in one of the towns. Oh, well, that's not specific at all. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields. On another Sabbath, he went into a synagogue. One of those days, Jesus went out to a mountainside. You see what I'm saying? It's willfully vague achronological language. I think Jesus took his disciples up on the hill. He started talking with them. A crowd spontaneously gathers of middle class to very impressive people. Jesus is aware of the religious leaders who are present with their rules and tradition and self-righteousness. And so while simultaneously building up those who want to follow him, he's pushing back on those religious leaders' ideas. They get all offended probably. The sermon ends and they all walk down the mountain. First person Jesus encounters coming down the mountain as he gets down onto the path back toward Capernaum is this leper. Jesus heals this leper. Doesn't seem like that big a deal to you or me. It's like another healing. But socially, at that time, this has enormous implications. That guy was intentionally marginalized, unclean, can't be around other humans. And he boldly comes up to Jesus. Jesus heals him. The guy is visibly clean. The religious leaders would have fled immediately. Like, they can't go to work if they're around somebody like that because they become ceremonially unclean. A whole bunch of other marginalized people with problems who weren't allowed to be at the fancy meeting up on the hill come out of the woodwork, and they realize they're invited. He just sits them right down there on a flat spot on that path back to Capernaum, and he runs it again, but with language that's going to make more sense to this hurting, broken crowd that is spontaneously gathered around him. That allows enough time for the centurion to get word and to come back, and for that miracle to unfold, and then for everything else to work out chronologically like Matthew described it. So you might be wondering, why did we just spend all this time on this question? Well, 1, I think it's really helpful to see where this happened to help picture stuff in the Bible and even some of the controversies surrounding the Bible. 2, it is a controversy. And you can pretend it's not a controversy and that there isn't an apparent conflict, or you can read the Bible with eyes wide open and do the eyes wide open faith thing, where we just lean into the hard stuff instead of running away from it. I'm not particularly threatened by this apparent conflict at all. I think we threw out a couple different options that could explain what's going on here. And I'm also not threatened at all by people who reject those options and just say, nah, doesn't check out to me. Looks like the Bible got it wrong. Okay, I don't own you. That's a reasonable read. Whatever the case, I think it is vitally important, especially when we're dealing with portions of the Bible that tackle such significant theology. Just read the thing honestly. Do our best to figure it out. And it's kind of fun to try to do that with the actual evidence of the place in view so we can think it through as best as we can.
So in summary, I think Jesus gave the Sermon on the Mount up here. A big crowd followed him down there to that flat level place. Some miracles happened. A new crowd formed up. And he gave a lot of the same content in a second sermon, the Sermon on the Plain, right down there. Does that make sense to you guys? Does that seem?
Yeah.
Should we leave?
Yes.
I see what your agenda is. All right, I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are on what we do with this Sermon on the Mount, Sermon on the Plain question. I got more of Israel to go explore, so we're going to get out of here. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour. Say goodbye. Take care. See you soon.